most entrepreneurs are experts in their own lane. They're expert in technology and expert in marketing, expert in whatever medical, but and that works for a little while with their business. And it was the case with us with the MSP. Was both my brother-in-law were experts in technology. We knew how to servers, clouds, everything technology kind of a thing. But where we struggled was the business aspects of things.
Welcome to the Building to Scale podcast, where we bring real entrepreneur stories that showcase the challenges and successes in building and scaling an entrepreneurial business. Our host, Jeff Chastain, has a long entrepreneurial history himself, having started and run multiple businesses. Today, he is the founder and CEO of Admentus, where he uses the entrepreneurial operating system to bring clarity to business leaders and provide the foundation they need to successfully scale their business. We believe that some of the best sources of information and experience for growing a successful business are our entrepreneurial peers. Stick around until the end of the show, and we will reveal how you can become our next guest on the show.
So welcome to episode number 1 of Building to Scale. Jeff Chastain, you're in the guest chair for the inaugural episode. Jeff, you are the founder of Admentus, and you're on the web at admentus.com. Thank you for being a guest.
Thank you for being a host on my own show. Yeah, thanks.
So, Jeff, by way of introduction, and again, folks listening to episode number 1 are probably going to, maybe they listen to a handful of episodes and then now they're like, okay, all right, I just want to binge this whole thing. And so they're starting at episode 1, or maybe they're listening to this episode today because they want to get a feel for what this podcast is all about. And so we'll get into that in a moment. But I thought, maybe a great place to start would be, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, thanks. And that's really, and that actually leads real well into the podcast itself, because my own entrepreneurial kind of story, my own entrepreneurial background is really kind of the impetus of the podcast itself is to hear stories and hear lessons learned, really. But my story starts actually back in corporate America. I wasn't the traditional kid out selling cookies and candy bars and stuff like that. That was never me. But after a number of years really in corporate America, I just felt like a lack of vision, a lack of purpose really in being in that job. It was just another number at that point, another cube kind of thing. And it was like, okay, what am I really contributing here? So I took my leave in the midst of yet another departmental reshuffling kind of a thing and went out into consulting really on the technology side, doing what today would have been known as a fractional CTO, 15 plus years ago, more years than I want to count most days. But in going through that journey, I did consulting work and then also started a managed services provider, an IT MSP, with my brother-in-law, and really experienced what I kind of found afterwards was okay, how do we manage people? How do we grow this thing beyond the initial 4 or 5 tech people that we had kind of a thing? And after 2 or 3 years, we wasted tremendous amount of money in various coaches, consultants, marketing tools, et cetera. Basically, we blew through all of our resources trying to get it to grow beyond that point and maxed out our resources at that point. Ended up having to close the business and spent several years digging out of it, trying to, because this next project will be the one that turns the boat kind of a thing. And we dug ourselves too big of a hole. But in continuing my consulting after that, I just kept running into business leaders that were looking to technology, trying to solve foundational business issues. That it would be the CEO that comes to me and says, hey, I want this new CRM system implemented that my buddy was talking about on the golf course because our sales numbers are down. So we go through all the implementation process, the training process, et cetera. And big surprise, he comes back, well, our sales numbers didn't increase. Like, well, duh, they didn't increase. You don't have a sales process. You don't know how to sell. Just having technology here just amplifies what's underneath it. So it was one of those things where I started looking at, okay, what's the next venture, kind of the entrepreneurial itch hit again kind of thing. How do I go, what's the next company I want to go build? And in doing my research, trying to figure out at that time, okay, what happened with the MSP? Why didn't this work? How do we actually grow this? I came across a book called Traction by Gino Wickman for EOS. And it's really just honestly, a simple, basic kind of business concepts. There's nothing rocket science in it. But what really struck me with that book and with the system was that it was concrete tools that I could literally take and do something with rather than the theoretical stuff we get in most business courses or most business books that talks about here's this grandiose concept of leadership. And you walk out of it and say, great, I want that, but what do I do today? Where's my to-do list? And EOS really gives you that practicality of here's how you manage vision, here's how you manage people and such. So I actually made the shift at that point from consulting into coaching to say, okay, this is some way that I can go actually help other business leaders, help other entrepreneurs rather than trying to sell them another widget, another technology tool kind of a thing there. So that's really been my practice for a while now, is actually coaching with this system. But in doing that, like I said, it's really about hearing other entrepreneurial stories, working with other entrepreneurs, say, okay, where have you been? What kind of challenges have you gone through? Was just meeting with a CPA firm here recently, kind of thing, that was talking about, yeah, we've grown up to 25 people now. We're trying to keep growing, but they don't necessarily feel attached. They don't necessarily feel clear on the vision. They don't necessarily feel tied into our processes and stuff. So it's those growing pains of saying, okay, how do we move forward? And so that was, in answer to your kind of second question there, really the impetus behind the Building to Scale podcast. And yeah, there's a ton of podcasts out there these days, but really this comes from the idea of saying at the top of any entrepreneurial venture is really almost a lonely place. It's like, okay, I started this company, I'm running into struggles. All of a sudden, I can't wrap my arms around this anymore. Where do I turn? What do I look for? And at least in my journey over the years from corporate America, consulting, building my own businesses, one of the best resources I found was simply talking to and listening to peers to say, okay, what have you done already? What have you struggled with? And how did you address that struggle in a practical sense again, where I know, hey, you went and looked at this tool or this system or this lesson learned that I can turn around and apply today in my own business without having to guess and figure out all the theory and everything like that. So the foundation of it really was just to say, hey, let's get together a bunch of entrepreneurs, a bunch of business leaders, kind of walk through their story and figure out, hey, what was some of the lessons they learned that hopefully somebody else, even just a step or two behind, could take this from them and say, okay, this is something I can use tomorrow. This is something I can go put into my business and potentially help us move the needle, move forward with it ourselves.
Yeah. And Jeff, again, in your work today, what would be some typical businesses that you work with, and what does that engagement end up looking like?
Well, typically I'm working with still that entrepreneurial kind of minded business. So it's somebody that, like I said, they're an expert in their own lane. They're an expert in technology, expert in medical, wherever their field is, but they're struggling trying to get the needle to move on that business, trying to grow that business, typically beyond the 7 to 10 kind of people, to where it's okay, all of a sudden I can't do this all myself, and I'm having to bring in leadership team. I'm actually having to build in structure, build in things, because they say typically you can only manage at most about 7 people directly by yourself. So once that team starts growing beyond 7, all of a sudden you got to start delegating, you got to start handing things off. And it's that the point where a lot of these entrepreneurs kind of figure out, hey, I really don't know how to manage people. I don't know how to identify and hire the right people to get the right fit. I don't know how to define processes and make sure we're really working with. So that's the kind of companies that I like coming in and working with to say, okay, it's not a failing here. It's not an issue of, okay, kill the business, move out, because that's really where we see it. Well, a lot of times, if you look at the life cycle of most of the entrepreneur businesses, you see the huge failure rates, the 90% plus upfront initial stage. But then once you get 5 to 7 years in, you start seeing this whole second round of failures on businesses. And a lot of times the ones I'm talking to here have made it to that stage of growth, whether it's the timeline or not, but still they made it to that stage of growth. And all of a sudden they're sitting there realizing on a daily basis that I'm spending all my time fighting fires. I'm got duct tape wrapped all around this thing, trying to hold it together. And I'm just going to quit and go start a new one. It's like, don't give up on it. This is still your dream here. Let's come in and build clarity, build foundation underneath that business, and really free you back up to have that passion that you had when you first started this business.
Yeah, nice. Now, Jeff, in terms of like this podcast, what's the thinking behind hosting a podcast where you're celebrating other business owners and asking them questions? Um, what are you looking to get from this?
Well, really, I just enjoyed, like I said, hearing the stories, sharing the stories. I'm a big one on just help first, give back kind of thing that I even find in my own practice. I was talking, see if I can talking to customers, prospects. It's not really something I can even go sell from EOS from a perspective. It's literally, it has to be a right fit. It has to be a help mentality here to say, yes, I realize you're struggling with profitability. You're struggling with productivity kind of a thing. Here is something I can help with because you've got to be able to buy into that. And really, that's the same idea with the podcast is saying, okay, I don't necessarily, I'm not an expert in business. I haven't been in, every business has got its own scenarios, its own things that come up, even life putting in with it kind of a thing. You mix life and business together. Every single story that we've talked to on this podcast before has been completely different. There's reoccurring themes, but it's still been completely different stories. So it's really saying, okay, how can I bring help back to the entrepreneurial community? And at least at this moment, it looks like I can bring help by bringing other stories there as well to my own expertise to say, okay, here's how I would solve something, but here's how they looked at it differently or how they
Yeah.
experienced it slightly differently and bring those stories back.
Yeah. And so you've had the opportunity now to build a really great community. And who are the types of people that let's say again, someone's listening to this podcast. Um, who is that person I guess if you were describing who the typical listener to this podcast would be?
Well, typically we're looking at really the entrepreneurial kind of already in business, so they're in that growth stage. They're not in the early startup phase most of the time. We do have some startups probably listening, trying to the ones that want to pre-plan or plan ahead of as much as possible kind of thing and get ahead of the curve. But really at this point, we're looking at the ones that are already at the 5, 10, 15 kind of employees. We're looking to move forward. We're looking to grow forward. We're looking to grow continually, not necessarily hitting the enterprise stage of business. It's not the big business people. It's still really that entrepreneurial growth minded kind of person. If I were to put numbers on it, I might say 10 to 250, 300 kind of employees, senior management, senior leadership team that's really saying, okay, how can I improve my business? How can I get more of what I want from my business and really move that needle forward?
Yeah, yeah. So Jeff, in terms of where we are now in the year 2021, and of course, 2020 was just such an, hit a lot of industries, hit a lot of businesses in different ways, and some businesses have been able to adapt and thrive as a result of some of the opportunities that were presented. But are there any implications to again, your background, your work in terms of maybe some trends or things that we've noticed throughout different industries?
Well, it's been really interesting because there was obviously the industry's obvious hit about restaurants, about entertainment, stuff like that, where people couldn't go out. So those are obvious hits. But it's been even more interesting looking at other industries where even in the same industry, you've got one business thriving, one business barely hanging on, if not worse, kind of a thing. And in talking with those, it really, to me, it actually goes back to an old biblical parable that says, okay, the wise man builds his house on the rock, foolish man builds his house on the sand. Storm's going to come no matter what, batter both houses, but it's the one that's built on the rock that's going to survive. And the reality is, we've seen it. Business is always going to be, there's going to be storms coming, whether it's a global pandemic that turns the corner on overnight shutting things down. That one was obviously really hard to prepare for, but it could be as simple as a key employee leaving. It could be 20 new clients landing on your doorstep all at once kind of a thing, and you're faced with this massive growth. But it really comes down to me, to the foundation underneath the business to say, okay, do we have the processes? Do we have the people? Do we have the identity sound enough here that we can weather whatever storm is coming? Because the reality is there's always going to be a storm coming no matter what, whether it's small localized or big global pandemic. It's just how strong is your foundation going forward.
Yeah. Um, and Jeff, in terms of someone is listening to this podcast, what is your hope for the listener? So they start listening to a handful of episodes, and what would you hope that they would gain from that?
really my hope is that they would pick up something or a tidbit to say, hey, they went through this too, or they struggled with this too. I'm not necessarily alone. And even better, this is how they got through it. Because like I said, being on the top of an entrepreneurial organization many times can feel rather lonely. It's like, I'm the only one going through this. Like I said, I was talking with a CPA firm just the other day, and the CEO made that comment. It's like, yeah, every single client we deal with is all unique here. It's like, well, yes, but I think pretty much every business owner would say that, to say, hey, every new job we do is unique. And the reality is what's underneath, there's a defined process, a defined way you handle that. Yeah, there may be some unique aspects, but there's a way you can simplify this and make your onboarding, your execution, whatever process differently. And in talking with her, it kind of got her to pause and think, like, oh, wait a minute, maybe we're not quite so unique in facing this challenge of a problem in only our industry, kind of a thing. And just helping branch out and say, wait a minute, you're really not, for good or bad, kind of a thing, you're not unique in this issue or unique in this challenge you're facing. Here's somebody else that's faced it as well. They did persevere through it, or maybe they didn't, but here's their lessons learned from not doing it. So therefore you can try not to make the same mistakes again.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, Jeff, so when you are not helping lay foundations and kind of build the structure for scalable companies, what do you do in your free time? What's fun family Jeff like?
Time? What's that? We don't know what free time is anymore. No, honestly, like I said, I've got a couple of kids that keeps very involved right there, kind of a thing, in all their activities. And that's really one of the things I really take away from my business, is being able to say, hey, I don't have to be 9 to 5 all the time. I've got flexibility that I can go put, I call it more Admentus or company kind of life right there, is to say, okay, everything's not business all day, every day, whether it's spending time with family, whether it's the church activities, whatever the case may be. Having the flexibility and the freedom to go out and do things outside of work is one of the big things that actually I even work with clients on, to say, okay, yes, here's all the business aspects we got to deal with, but we need to focus on the self side as well. You need to take care of yourself. You need to have the outside time. You need to have the self take care right there, not from a selfish standpoint, but simply from the fact that, okay, if you're burning the candle on both ends of the stick right here, you're not going to be any good to the rest of the company. So being able to take that time away is really critical. So yeah, it's a lot of kids activities where, for whatever reason around here, soccer season is in the middle of winter. So we go out and play soccer at 30 degrees outside and do those kind of games with the kids and stuff like that. But it's just family time, kids and stuff like that afterwards. And honestly, with, like I said, having teenage kids right now, that's all the time I've got pretty much. So I'll take up every bit that I can.
Yeah. And so finally, for someone who's listening to this conversation, who would be a great person you'd love to connect with, and what would they do? Like, if they're like, okay, well, listen, we're definitely entering into, scaling territory, and some of that makes me nervous because, I certainly have built it up to a certain level. Maybe they've built it up to, they just are approaching 7 figures now, but they're looking ahead and they're like, man, how do we go from $1 million in sales to 8 million in sales, which we think looks like it's going to be happening over the next couple of years? That's going to be a different kind of company. So they have concerns. And, again, the EOS framework is something that's perfectly suited for that type of company. And so someone who's in that position, decision maker with a company that size, what would you recommend that their next steps be?
Well, we've actually got, through the website right here with admentus.com, we've got a ongoing workshop that we do at least once a month here. That's just a non-sales informational workshop about the system itself, just to give you some more experience, exposure to the system, to see if it's a right fit. Because like I said, it's got to be a right fit. It's definitely a journey. It's not something that you go implement overnight or go try a book kind of a thing and pick and choose. But it's that way is really the quickest way to kind of get that exposure. And then honestly, if that doesn't fit, then feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to schedule just a complimentary kind of session. We'll walk through it all with you and your leadership team. But yeah, just any of those, exactly what you described, any of those entrepreneurial kind of business leaders, hey, I'm looking to grow. I'm not sure I have all the answers here, and then could use some outside assistance, because the accountability part is really key too. That anytime you can bring somebody out from the outside and say, hey, why are you doing things that way? Well, that's the way we've always done things. Like, okay, there's a different idea. There's something that might be a little bit better, might help you move that needle forward a little bit more here.
All right, Jeff Chastain, founder of Admentus. You're found on the web at admentus.com. That's ADMENTUS.com. Jeff, thanks so much.
Thank you very much. We'll talk soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Building to Scale podcast. If you would like to share your entrepreneurial business growth story, please visit buildingtoscale.com/guest. If you got something out of this interview, would you do both us and our guest a favor and share it on your social media accounts? Don't forget to hit subscribe in your player so that you don't miss any future episodes. And make sure to reach out to Jeff Chastain on the social networks. To learn more about what we are doing and how it might benefit your business, check us out at admentus.com. Thanks again for listening.